In 1992, in the midst of protests and criticism, America, Canada, and Mexico agreed to the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was implemented in 1994, with the premise of eliminating trade barriers between the three nations. The only country that didn't benefit was Mexico, because its labor and exports would be frequently undervalued. On the same day, January 1st, 1994, that NAFTA went into effect, the leftist Zapatista Army, or EZLN, declared war on the Mexican government for its neoliberal policies, particularly highlighting how NAFTA would hurt indigenous Mexicans and peasants. They immediately seized 6 towns and set up their own society. Other events, including the assassination of a presidential candidate, led to steep risk premiums on Mexican assets. This damaged the Mexican economy, as the Treasury had been wooing foreign investors with short-term debt investments. A series of events led to a sharp devaluation of the peso and a rise in interest rates on December 20, 1994, which impacted related economies in Central America and Asia and created a crisis in Mexico that the U.S. would consider providing aid for. In 1992, the Salvadorian Civil War ended after the fighting first began in 1979, and the death count was over 75,000 people. In April 1990, Nicaragua elected Violeta Chamorro to the presidency, ousting Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega. The U.S. government had announced in 1989 that it would continue an embargo against the country if Chamorro lost. She was expected to dismantle Sandinista programs and achievements, namely the labor reform, land redistribution, and agricultural reforms that benefited 60% of rural families and made 47% of the country's agricultural production in the hands of small producers and cooperatives. Under Sandinistas, women have been given paid maternity leave and equal access to divorce, despite the heavily religious and patriarchal culture of the country. After initial violence and restrictions, the Sandinista government also guaranteed the rights and autonomy of the indigenous non-Hispanic community. But in addition to CIA meddling and armed conflict with the Contras, the 1988 Hurricane Joan Miriam destroyed infrastructure and ruined the agricultural industry, exacerbating an already in-progress recession. So in 1990, the right-wing fundamentalist party that Violeta Chamorro belonged to moved to reprivatize industries, take back land, and ramp up the structural adjustment program to be eligible for an IMF loan by 1994. Between 1990 and 1994, Nicaragua received the highest per capita foreign aid of any developing country. As the illiteracy rate rose, healthcare became increasingly privatized, and the state budget was cut in half. The U.S. put a lot of money and resources into Nicaragua during the Chamorro period, with the goal of sending Sandinistas into irreversible retreat, largely funding conservative trade unions, the Supreme Council of Private Enterprise, and conservative non-governmental organizations. Jesse Helms, the Senate Foreign Relations Chair, led calls for Nicaragua to give back land to supporters of the dictatorship the Sandinistas had overthrown. Meanwhile, the Sandinista party was splintering, and Daniel Ortega was preparing his political comeback with a radically different ideology than before. Of all the countries in South America, Colombia received the most U.S. money at the early 90s, and most of it went to the police, who were both fighting and benefiting from the thriving drug trade. Pablo Escobar, leader of the Medellin cartel, and other drug lords were in the middle of terrorizing the government into blocking an extradition agreement with the U.S., and the violence seemed never ending. Finally, Colombia's 1991 constitution prohibited the U.S. from extraditing Colombian citizens, and Cesar Gaviria's government handled Escobar with kid gloves, promising he would get special treatment and a reduced sentence if he agreed to give up his narco-terrorism campaign. Escobar agreed and was interred in his mansion, La Cathedral, a fabulous private prison with amenities like a jacuzzi and a bar. Unsurprisingly, Escobar continued running the cartel from his prison, and when the government made plans to move him to a regular prison in 1992 when he caught wind of it, he fled.
While hundreds of soldiers and police intensified their manhunt today, embarrassed authorities were still trying to figure out how Escobar could have escaped from a prison surrounded by the Colombian army. Their best guess is that during a gun battle with soldiers who were trying to move him from the prison to a military base yesterday morning, Escobar and 9 other traffickers slipped out with the help of sympathetic guards. Speculation is Escobar used a tunnel, but authorities cannot find one. The escape is a major setback for the Colombian government, because when Escobar surrendered last year, the Colombians argued they could keep him safe in one of their prisons rather than extradite him to the United States.
He spent the next year being hunted down by the U.S. Colombian governments, the Calli cartel, and Los Pepes, a paramilitary group of his enemies. He was finally located on December 2nd, 1993, and killed in a shootout. The Colombian government turned its attention away from the Medellin cartel to the Calli cartel, who grew to have control of 80% of the world's cocaine market at its peak. So while Escobar was gone, the violence didn't end, and it wasn't all narco-terrorism either. By 1993, an average of 11 people were killed per day in the first half of the year in Colombia by a combination of state forces, guerrilla groups, and drug mafias. Between 92 and 99, Western Colombia was terrorized by a child rapist and murderer, with approximately 200 victims, mostly boys, going missing and turning up in mass graves. The perpetrator, Garavito, got away with it for so long because of the corrupt nature of the police and the widespread killings of street children, sex workers, and other undesirables that were linked to police. In March 1993, there was international outrage from the news that a 10-year-old girl named Catalina Vasquez was raped and killed inside of a Bogota police station while going to visit her father, a cop. There was an increased call for police reform, and the murderer was eventually revealed to be a cop. So at the dawn of the 90s in Peru, the country was in a massive debt, and the population was suffering from malnutrition. It was estimated that over half of them were living in abject misery. Detailed Time magazine in 1990. Overnight, the price of gasoline jumped from 10 cents per gallon to more than $2, and food prices rose 300%. The 1990 presidential elections were shaken up when dark horse candidate Alberto Fujimori challenged the white neoliberal candidate. Due to his Japanese ancestry, the public affectionately called him El Chino, or Chinaman. He campaigned on a somewhat left-leaning populist platform and netted 62.4% of the popular vote. Upon entering office, he promptly accepted world aid, began pressing Congress for more aggressive means to catch Abimael Guzman, the Shining Path leader who had evaded capture for 12 years as the terrorist group bombed infrastructure and slaughtered civilians, and Congress wasn't in total agreement with that. So in 1992, Fujimori led a self-coup by shutting down Congress and suspending the Constitution and judiciary. This act was denounced by the international community, but allegedly supported by the Peruvian public. After all, they had to deal with the Shining Path. In May 1992 alone, there were reported 123 terrorist attacks, and 112 of them were alleged by the Fujimori government to be by the Shining Path, who were ramping up their violence in response to the coup. Fujimori issued decrees with harsh penalties for terrorists and collaborators. Certain areas with heavy Shining Path activity were labeled emergency zones, where constitutional rights were suspended to fight the terrorists. After July 16, 1992 bomb killed 25 people and injured 155 more in Lima, Peruvian authorities increased surveillance, which led to the apprehension of Abimael Guzman and the fall of Shining Path. While Fujimori was celebrated for stamping out the Shining Path, it didn't obscure his major flaws. In 1994, his own wife, Susanna Higuchi, denounced him as a corrupt tyrant. Fujimori was eligible to run for president again in 1995, the same year that Susanna filed for divorce, and Fujimori's eligibility worked out for a bunch of parties, including the U.S. and the head of Peru's National Intelligence Service, Vladimiro Montesinos. Under Montesinos' firm grip, to the point that he was the de facto leader of Peruvian affairs, Fujimori had abandoned his campaign platform and enacted policies more aggressive than his neoliberal opponent had championed. This included the Fuji Shock, or making state-owned enterprises private and implementing structural adjustment for IMF loans, which, as you've noticed, has come up a lot in this episode. Montesinos remarked about Fujimori once, "He is completely malleable. He does nothing at all without me knowing." The administration spent a lot of money bribing Peruvian media to not question Fujimori, in addition to producing more trash TV. Montesinos had been pocketing $1 million a year from the CIA since 1990, with the assurance that he would serve U.S. business interests, like when he gave U.S. company Newmont a majority ownership of a gold mine. Montesinos and Fujimori were aligned with the plot to implement Plan Verde, a military op by the Peruvian armed forces to control the country via media censorship and the genocide of indigenous and impoverished Peruvians. In 1991, the National Population Program was developed by the Peruvian National Population Council. Beginning in 1993, 200,000 women would be sterilized without their consent before the decade was over, which was facilitated in part by the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. And their justification was the 1974 Kissinger Report, which encouraged low populations in developing countries to serve U.S. interests. Speaking of U.S. facilitation of oppression in South America, there were the revelations about the archives of terror. Found in 1992 inside an old abandoned building in Paraguay were documents detailing the secret kidnappings, tortures, and killings of thousands of Latin Americans, mostly leftists, by security services of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay in the U.S.'s Operation Condor. Remarked Castro on the hypocrisy of American benevolence in 1994. Those who blockade us have had good relations with South Africa, excellent relations with Chile, where thousands of people have been killed, in Argentina, where thousands of people are missing. The devaluation of the Mexican peso occurred at the end of December 1994 and for the first 10 months of 95. U.S. exports to Mexico dropped while foreign investors fled. However, Mexican tourism bookings saw a 10 to 12% increase as vacationers took advantage of killer deals. New President Ernesto Zedillo announced that the government would be cutting spending, selling off assets, and making sure wages lagged behind inflation. On January 17th, he signed an agreement with opposing politicians to maintain fair elections and keep foreign investors happy. As the Mexican economy stalled, observers predicted a huge wave of immigrants flooding into America. For some, Mexico's strife was a clear example of neoliberal policies gutting a nation. Since the 80s, state enterprises had been sold, labor had been weakened, and 23 billionaires had been created. The Clinton administration authorized a $20 billion loan to Mexico without congressional approval, ruffling more than a few feathers. Critics claimed Clinton's decision was simply a bailout of American companies in Mexico. Wrote Jorge Castaneda, American taxpayers cannot first be told that their country has just signed a free trade pact with a modern, dynamic, successful nation, and a few months later be informed that they must co-sign a credit of up to $40 billion to save that same nation from chaos. Others complained that the loan would destroy America. Cried Pat Buchanan, it was daylight robbery of the nation's wealth. It is money the American taxpayers will never see again. This turned out to be a dramatic lie, as Mexico only borrowed 60% of the $20 billion and paid it back 3 years ahead of schedule, including $500 million in interest. But, wrote David E. Sanger, while the administration was eager to describe Mexico today as a patient in recovery, the cost was high for Mexican workers who lost their jobs during the austerity program imposed as a condition of the loans, for homeowners who were unable to pay their mortgages, and for businesses that suddenly found themselves caught in a severe recession. Crime has soared in Mexico City. The pay of Mexican workers is still badly depressed, and the peso has stabilized but failed to return to its earlier values. There was also an $18 billion trade deficit with Mexico. Yay, NAFTA! Zedillo continued to seek to better Mexico's global ties, like courting China, but the U.S. was its biggest apple. U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry was the first in the modern era to personally visit Mexico in 1995, leading to $50 million in arms and military training the following year. And U.S. presidents had skipped visiting Mexico since 1979 until Clinton's journey in 97. The two countries announced a joint strategy to fight drug and gun trafficking. Said Clinton, "We have less than 5% of the world's population and we consume about half the drugs. And we're more than happy every year, American citizens, to give billions of dollars that winds up in the hands of narco traffickers." A major part of the strategy was granting DEA agents the authority to be armed while in Mexico, generating concern. Zedillo assured critics that the alliance was based on absolute respect of sovereignty and territorial jurisdiction of Mexico and of the United States. Clinton, who began militarizing the border in 93 and 94, also swore to not carry out mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. Between 1999 and 2000, over 700,000 Mexicans arrived to the U.S., moving further from the border to places like Atlanta, Raleigh, Portland, and Seattle. Remember the EZLN, aka the Zapatistas, and the shaky peace established under the previous president? In February 1995, President Zedillo revealed the identity of the group's mass leader, Subcomandante Marcos, as a Marxist former professor named Rafael Vicente. The Mexican government issued arrest warrants and the military was ordered to capture and destroy the Zapatistas. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans held rallies in support of Marcos and the EZLN in Mexico City. When the military held a faction of the EZLN under siege, Zedillo went the diplomatic route. He and his cabinet recognized that the EZLN were a less brutal and more pacifist alternative to leftist groups that would emerge if Marcos was killed. There were a series of meetings and peace talks, and by February 96, the government and the Zapatistas signed the San Andres Accords. EZLN members who had committed terrorism were released from prison. In the aftermath, Zapatistas continually controlled small areas of Chiapas, but would not be legally recognized by the government. In 1997, the same year that Zedillo privatized the state railway company, 45 pacifist Catholic indigenous people called Las Abejas, or the Bees, were murdered in the small village of Assata in Chiapas. The Bees were supporters of the EZLN, and among them included pregnant women and 18 children. The perpetrators were the right-wing paramilitary group, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Mexican presidents had come from this party for 71 years, and 2000 would be their year of reckoning. Between October 22nd and November 9th, 1998, Hurricane Mitch, the deadliest hurricane in Central America on record since 1780, ravaged the area. Guatemala was the scene of severe flooding and hundreds of millions in damages, leaving millions homeless. Mitch killed over 7,000 people in Honduras, where all 18 of the country's regions or departments were impacted. 70 to 80% of Honduras's transportation network was destroyed, along with 70% of its crops. In the end, there were $665 million in damages. As a result of Hurricane Mitch, the U.S. suspended deportations of undocumented people to Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and offered those already in the country the ability to apply for temporary protection status. But, reported Ginger Thompson, by applying, Central Americans make themselves known to the INS, and some fear that the INS may move to deport Central Americans after TPS expires. Some lawyers urge clients to apply for TPS so that they can get work permits and better jobs. They also believe that TPS may be extended, and that in any case, there is unlikely to be a deportation campaign after TPS expires. Foreign countries wrangled together $6.3 billion to help the ailing countries after Hurricane Mitch. There were 3,800 more deaths from Mitch in Nicaragua, where massive landslides left entire areas in ruins and uncovered long buried landmines. Nicaragua was struggling from social and economic decline under Violeta Chamorro between 1990 and 1997. Public spending per person on health went from $35 in 1989 to just $14 in 1995, as child care centers closed and life expectancy dropped from 66 to 60 in the same period. More women became entangled in sex work and crime due to financial and food insecurity, and these were the issues binding Nicaragua's election in '96. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas lost to Arnaldo Ailman of the Constitutional Liberal Party. During this election, Ortega attempted to tone down his anti-imperialist and American rhetoric, but he was no match for Ailman, who would go on to grow foreign investment. In 1995, the same year that the Colombian native and incipient queen of Latin Shakira went on her first international tour, the multi-billion-dollar money laundering schemes of the Cali cartel were brought into the spotlight. An estimated $3 billion a year was being invested into American companies in exchange for electronics and other goods sent back to Colombia. More money was being spent on paintings in London and New York and luxury housing and real estate development in Colombia. The country had benefited from the illicit trade, even generating a $5 billion budget surplus after a long period of decline. In October 1995, 33 companies were identified as fronts for the Cali cartel, whom Clinton ordered U.S. companies to cease trading with. Sanctions were placed on known cartel associates, and stricter protocols for sending money to Colombia were implemented. Reported the New York Times, besides employing innovative trade schemes, authorities say drug traffickers are shipping cash in everything from used cars and dolls to television sets and refrigerated containers of bull semen. When a forklift accidentally punctured a shipping pallet in a warehouse on West 32nd Street, workers were shocked to see $100 bills tumble pull out. By the end of '95, all of the major players of the Cali cartel were in custody, but lieutenants were ready to replace them. Thousands of acres of drug crops and 243 drug labs were destroyed in crackdowns in the first half of the year alone. But rumors that President Ernesto Samper funded his 1994 campaign with drug money from the cartel reached such a fever pitch that he admitted to it in January 1996, saying he was tricked and demanded an investigation. Clinton sent $1 billion in aid to Colombia in wake of the scandal to fight drug trafficking. Samper was absolved of wrongdoing, but members of his team, including his campaign manager, were jailed for corruption. Samper's reputation took another hit in September 1996 when 7.4 pounds of heroin was found on his jet in Bogota before a scheduled flight to New York. That same year, the Marxist-Leninist group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, launched a fresh campaign of terrorism funded with illegal mining, drugs, extortion, ransoms, and other unsavory means. On February 11, 1997, in Bogota, 800,000 workers walked out in protest of privatization and austerity. These included teachers, public transit workers, oil workers, healthcare professionals, and prison guards. Union leaders threatened to extend the strike outside of Bogota into 5 other cities. This general strike triggered the government to agree to a 20% increase in public workers' salaries just 7 days later. The protests were significant because Colombia had long been hostile to union leaders. As a result of the strike, multiple union leaders would be killed in the following years, including the head of Colombian Coca-Cola workers, likely by right-wing death squads with close links to the authorities. In 1996 alone, 20 union workers at Coca-Cola had been disappeared or assassinated. Local Coca-Cola executives were accused of using paramilitary groups and death squads to stomp out unions, culminating in plans for a lawsuit by the International Labor Rights Fund and the United Steelworkers of America. Over in Venezuela in December 1994, the pardoned socialist and former Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez met with Castro in Cuba. Chavez was recovering after the 1992 failed coup of President Carlos Perez, who had reneged on his promise to reject IMF funds. Chavez toured Central and South America and built support in Venezuela, reportedly receiving military training from Cuba. Despite being skeptical of the electoral system and doubtful that he'd have the chance to win, in July 1997, Chavez created the Fifth Republic Movement Party to seek presidential election the following year and change the constitution. The party focused on rousing the poor and implementing Bolivarianism, a strain of socialism that centers anti-imperialism, Latin American self-sufficiency, nationalism, and equity in resources. The 1998 elections were the first with National Electoral Council impartiality. Initially, Irene Saez, a former Miss Universe and a mayor of Chacao municipality, made a splash. Reported the LA Times, a political independent, she focuses on pragmatism rather than ideology. She has hired top-notch administrators and listens to their advice about setting the budget and taxes and running public services such as the police and garbage collection. At the same time, she has avoided the endemic political patronage and corruption that have undermined Venezuelans' confidence in government. Irene was so popular in Chacao that she was re-elected to her mayoral position with 96% of the vote. However, for national leadership, Irene was beat out by central-right candidate Enrique Salas Romer, who eventually won runner-up. The elections were heavily impacted by the Asian economic crisis as well. As the campaign progressed, Chavez tempered himself to be more centrist, though he still was open about his goal to change the constitution, pledging to open up elections to more than just 2 parties and to end corruption and poverty. With a 63% voter turnout, Chavez won 56.2% of the vote. He promptly rolled out a new constitution and renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The Constitution had new protections for indigenous people, extended the presidential term to 6 years, and weakened checks and balances by reducing Congress into a unicameral National Assembly. Next came Plan Bolivar 2000, which sent 70,000 military members to repair infrastructure, deliver food and medicine, and provide vaccines around the country beginning in February 1999. Chavez was a pragmatist who didn't turn down a chance to ring the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange in 1999. Venezuela nurtured relationships with Cuba and Iran and helped Venezuela's oil industry via a plan to tour OPEC nations. Chavez's victory and achievements would become highly influential in Latin America in the next decade. In October 1998, former Chilean dictator Auguste Pinochet went to London for medical treatment. A judge in Spain issued an international arrest warrant for Pinochet's crimes against Spanish citizens. The UK government placed Pinochet under house arrest as debates about universal jurisdiction ensued. Just a few months earlier, a top aide of Saddam Hussein had visited Vienna for medical treatment without being arrested as a perpetrator of genocide against the Kurds. Why? Austria wanted to stay on good terms with Iraq. And this was the most common scenario for top world leaders before Pinochet. Some wanted the elderly Pinochet to face full penalties from international powers for his human rights abuses, while others like Margaret Thatcher campaigned that he be returned to Chile to face charges from his own people. A British court ruled that Pinochet should be extradited to Spain, but a mental exam found him incompetent and he was released and sent back to Chile in 2000. In 1995, President Alberto Fujimori coasted through the Peruvian general elections. His estranged wife Susana Higuchi unsuccessfully ran for president against him and started a hunger strike on January 18th to protest a new law passed by Congress that banned the president's family from attaining national office. She ended the strike 6 days later. The freshly elected Congress also passed a law declaring amnesty for law enforcement and military officials accused of human rights abuses between 1980 and 1995 to public outcry. The Catholic Church in Lima was one high-profile group that called it dangerous. In the wake of ongoing Shining Path terrorism, only 6 legislators out of 130 voted against the measure. Said Fujimori, "Of course, amnesty is a controversial measure, but this is part of the strategy to fight terrorism. I don't deny there were isolated cases of human rights violations by the military in the past, but I want to put this period of violence behind us with this amnesty measure." Described to AP, the Peruvian leader said he did not understand how the United States could be so critical when Americans were also demanding effective measures to fight terrorism after the Oklahoma bombing. In addition to easing tensions with Chile, Peru resolved an ongoing border dispute with Ecuador in the extremely short 34-day Cenepa War, which began on my birthday in 1995 and ended 2 days later. Hundreds were killed on both sides. Though he had once been affectionately called Chinaman, Fujimori was now Pinochet, a comparison to the former dictator of Chile. Said Cesar Hildebrandt in 1995, "Fujimorism installs with each day that passes a system that operated for 6 decades in Mexico, the model of a single-party system sustained by the army, the business sector, and the greater part of the electronic media. We are watching the birth of a hidden dictatorship." In response to Fujimori's growing fascism, university students and staff in Lima protested the unfair elections and the state takeover of 2 private institutions. Fujimori claimed the move was to stamp out rebel infiltration. Hours before Fujimori passed the university law, a car bomb exploded outside of a luxury hotel casino and killed 4 people in Lima, and the perpetrators were believed to be the Shining Path. On December 17, 1996, 14 members of the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA, attacked the home of the Japanese ambassador while he was hosting a party, taking hundreds of people hostage for the next 126 days. The MRTA, who are Marxist-Leninists, demanded the release of approximately 450 members from prison, a reformation of neoliberal policies, and prison reform. They were heavily armed and wired the home with explosives, making an armed assault ill-advised. As Peruvian stock prices plummeted, Fujimori addressed the public 5 days later, after the MRTA leader Nestor Serpa said that all non-Peruvian government hostages would be released. The group allowed female hostages to leave, and eventually all were released except for 72 men. A female journalist named Sally Bowen, who attempted to stay, was denied. Fujimori attempted peaceful resolution, trying to convince other countries, primarily Cuba, to accept the terrorists as political exiles. The MRTA reneged on their promise to kill a foreign minister hostage if Fujimori didn't show up for negotiations, making them look weak. They also attempted to persuade hostages to become leftists. Reported Diana Jean Shimo on the Recollections of a Hostage, he announced that there would be no killing, at least not by the Tupac Amaru. Instead, the hostages say, Mr. Serpa tried to win over his captives, engaging them in philosophical conversations about the free market economy and the poor, whose lot he felt would never improve. Though his band of rebels could not hold hundreds of people against their will over the long run, he used the first few days to expound his ideas, seemingly in an attempt to send the first captives out as favorable emissaries. Throughout the crisis, the Peruvian government prepared for a raid by sneaking in surveillance equipment with food deliveries. As the days stretched into weeks and months, the MRTA members began relaxing their guard, even having a daily period of soccer that would ultimately quicken their downfall. With American military forces on standby, Peruvian officials attempted to dig tunnels underneath the building, but MRTA heard and stopped negotiating. Despite this, a small number of hostages were in constant contact with Peruvian forces. They were informed that a raid would begin on April 22, 1997. Peruvian commandos were instructed to take no prisoners. At approximately 3:23 p.m., when MRTA members played soccer, 3 simultaneous explosives were triggered and commandos swarmed the building. By the end of the raid, 1 hostage and all 14 members of the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement were dead. One MRTA operative had attempted to walk out with the hostages and was seen, taken to the back of the residence, and executed. The incident ended the MRTA as a threat to Peru and doubled Fujimori's approval ratings, giving him good PR. Reported Diana Jean Shimo, Mr. Fujimori, whose popularity rating skyrocketed 29 points to 67% in just a few days, returned to the residence a day after the raid to be photographed with the bloated and headless bodies of his enemies at his feet, and macabre footage taken by government cameramen and broadcast repeatedly on television. The circumstances of the deaths of the terrorists, 8 of whom had died after being captured or surrendering, were murky until the next century. Their bodies weren't returned to their families, and 4 of them were teenagers. An MRTA spokesperson commented on Fujimori's alleged victory for Peru, saying, "A vast segment of the population still suffers from poverty, hunger, and a lack of proper medical care, and these problems are increasing." The end of the crisis at the ambassador's residence showed that Fujimori exclusively relies on military means. In the background of all of this, Fujimori and Vladimiro Montesinos, the head of the NIS, continued to corrupt the Ministry of Economy and Finance and sterilize Peru's indigenous population through their sinister Plan Verde. In 1999, Fujimori announced he was running for president again, but his support was eroded by ongoing censorship and corruption, and the new millennium would be rough for Fujimori. Over in Brazil, under sociologist Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who began his presidential term on January 1st, 1995, the economy somewhat stabilized after years of hyperinflation, though debt would rise for 7 years. As a neoliberal, Cardoso notably improved foreign outreach, privatized public industries, created new regulatory agencies, implemented universal primary education, and erected the Ministry of Sports, which was turned into the Ministry of Tourism before being separated into 2 categories. Decree 1775 in 1996 designated indigenous lands at the discretion of the Minister of Justice and opened up these lands to be contested by commercial and private entities. By April 1996, 40 different indigenous lands were hit with 500 lawsuits, and indigenous Brazilians were rightfully upset. Cardoso also claimed to have 1 foot in the kitchen or to be slightly mulatto and campaigned on racial equality. To his credit, he was the first Brazilian president to address racism and wealth inequality, highly significant in the country with the largest black population outside of nations on the African continent. Afro-Brazilians, or pretos, were reported to experience harsh discrimination in employment, higher rates of poverty and violence, and to be missing from prominent positions of power. There were abhorrent laws like elevator segregation. On Brazilian TV, which was being hotly debated by the mid-90s for its sexual content, most performers were white, like the extremely popular children's TV show host, singer, Playboy model, and actress, Xuxa. The whiteness and thinness of Brazil's TV stars would fuel a thriving plastic surgery culture where procedures are often free or low cost, which is based in eugenics and racism. In 1995, plastic surgeon and creator of the Brazilian butt lift, Ivo Pitangui, published a book encouraging the connection between physical beauty and happiness. By 1998, when 60 Minutes was profiling the doctor, he had operated on over 45,000 people, some for free. Described the Chicago Tribune, every Wednesday morning, the poor line the humid corridors for a chance to be seen by their city's virtuoso, and in some cases, operated on by one of his interns. Said Pitangui, "I wanted to take all the mystique away and make it something any social class could obtain. More democratic." At the time, Rio had more plastic surgeons per capita than any other city in the world. On November 24th, 1995, Brazil honored a 17th century Afro-Brazilian abolitionist named Zumbi. The event drew out 30,000 pretos to march against discrimination, becoming one of the largest black assemblies in the country's history. Afro Afro-Brazilian leaders would link with Cardoso to discuss implementing affirmative action programs and civil rights protections similar to America's. Afro-Brazilians gained more visibility and fragile expectations of human rights, but still had to deal with police, who could legally torture and extort money from civilians. Torture didn't become illegal until 1997, after police brutality was caught on camera. This was also the same year that popular singer, comedian, and future politician Tiririca issued the racist song, "Look at Her Hair." He claimed the song was a joke about his Afro-Brazilian wife, but a Rio de Janeiro-based civil rights group sued. A judge ruled that the song, distributed by Sony, be pulled from the album. Lastly, like many Latin American countries, Brazil was impacted by the global financial crisis buckling Asia and Russia in 1998. It wasn't as bad as the recession that wrecked neighbor Argentina from 1998 to 2002, but investors fled, and as a result, Brazil got a $41.5 billion rescue package from global institutions in November 1998.